Please welcome to the stage a leader in public health and civil rights law, founder and inaugural director of GW's newly chartered Equity Institute, Dean and Harold H. Green Professor of Law, Dr. Dana Bowen Matthew.
Good afternoon. As you've heard, I'm Dana Bowen Matthew. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. It's my great privilege to welcome you to the first in a 5-part series of conversations focusing on the life and distinguished career of recently retired United States Supreme Court Justice Stephen G. Breyer. This Only at GW series of exclusive interviews will continue throughout the year, creating a comprehensive oral history of the arc of Justice Breyer's illustrious career. Each of the 5 conversations will feature a prominent moderator who will interview Justice Breyer about his life before, leading up to, and as a Supreme Court Justice, and how his life impacted his work. We are doubly fortunate and in for a real treat as we begin the series this afternoon with the first conversation. So today, Justice Breyer and his brother, Senior District Judge Charles R. Breyer, will engage in what is sure to be a memorable conversation with GW Law Associate Dean Alan Morrison, and it'll be about their formative years growing up in San Francisco. The second conversation will be held on May 16th, when I will have the great honor of interviewing the Justice about his years at Harvard Law School, both as a student and a faculty member, his clerkship with the United States Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, and his time working in the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. The 3 remaining events will be held over the next academic year and will cover Justice Breyer's years working in the United States Senate, his time on the First Circuit, the Sentencing Commission, and his 28 years on the Supreme Court of the United States. This amazing series would not have been possible without the vision and tireless effort of my colleague and friend, Alan Morrison. He has been a good friend of Justice Breyer's for more than 40 years, and I extend my sincere gratitude to you, Alan, for moderating today's conversation and making the series possible. Now bear with me because there are a number of other people that I also want to thank for their hard work and expert planning that have made this series possible. First, I want to thank Paul Haggerty and our university events team. Next, Deb Gales and our law school events team. I also want to say thank you last but certainly not least to our provost, Chris Bracey, and our president, Mark Wrighton, and their teams for making today possible. It's now my great honor to introduce our distinguished guest and moderator. First, Justice Breyer. He retired as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court on June 30th, 2022. He was appointed to the court in 1994 by President Bill Clinton. He quickly cultivated a reputation as one of the most pragmatic justices on the bench and made decisions based on real-world consequences. Long before taking his seat on the Supreme Court, he was a law professor at Harvard, where he began a specialty in administrative law and wrote a number of influential articles, books, and textbooks that are still in use today. Prior to his Supreme Court nomination, Justice Breyer held a number of other prominent positions, including Special Assistant to the United States Attorney General for Antitrust, Assistant Special Prosecutor on the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, Chief Judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, and Chief Counsel of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee, where he worked closely with Senator Ed Kennedy to pass the Airline Deregulation Act. On the bench, Justice Breyer was widely respected as a centrist, a consensus-building institutionalist, and a rationalist. He is also a great friend of our law school. Over the years, he has spoken at many GW Law events, judged our moot court competition, and visited our classrooms to share his wisdom with our students. Justice Breyer, thank you for being such a great friend of the GW Law School. Next, the Honorable Charles R. Breyer. He is a senior district judge in the Northern District of California and was appointed to the bench in 1997, also by President Bill Clinton. Highlighting just a few of the many great achievements of Judge Breyer's illustrious career, he was an assistant special prosecutor on the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, served on the judicial panel in the multi-district litigation, and served for 2 terms as vice chairman of the United States Sentencing Commission, also as acting chair of the commission from 2018 to 2022. In 2018, Judge Breyer received the DeWitt Award, which is the highest honor bestowed on an Article III federal judge. Welcome and thank you for being here, Judge Breyer. And finally, joining Justice Breyer and Judge Breyer on the stage today is our own GW Law Associate Dean Alan B. Morrison. Dean Morrison is the Lerner Family Associate Dean for Public Interest and Public Service here at GW, where he teaches civil procedure and constitutional law. He does an extraordinary job of building pro bono, public service, and public interest jobs in our new Center for Public Interest Law at GW Law. Prior to entering the Legal Academy, Dean Morrison co-founded the Public Citizen Litigation Group with Ralph Nader in 1972. He directed it for over 25 years, and to his credit, in addition to his long-term friendship with Justice Breyer, he has argued 20 cases before the United States Supreme Court. So now, with introductions behind me and gratitude expressed, I invite you all now to please join me in welcoming Justice Breyer, Judge Breyer, and Dean Morrison.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, let's get started. The Breyer brothers were born in San Francisco. Tell us a little bit about the neighborhood you lived in, what it was like, single-family homes, what part of San Francisco. Many of us have been to San Francisco, but we weren't there when you were there growing up.
You may have been.
No, I actually was not far from there, but.
Oh, well, first of all, I know a number of you are wondering why I am here. And that question may not be answered to your satisfaction at the conclusion of this interview, but I am here to provide some truth and a little comic relief. So let me, I don't remember, San Francisco quite the same way that my brother remembers it. And I think it'd be interesting to hear his impressions. Growing up in San Francisco, of course, it was a city of wonderful opportunities. It was cosmopolitan. It was, I describe it as a small town with a big town's attitude. And, even though sort of everybody knew each other, it had a lot of different ethnic input. And I think that became, for us, the norm. That's what we understood our lives were like, and we were exposed to that. And our mother was, of course, very interested in things like the League of Women Voters. She participated in the PTA. She participated in democratic politics. And our father was the attorney for the Board of Education in San Francisco for 41 years. And we were exposed to that.
So what was your neighborhood like?
It was little one-block streets, 4 blocks west of Masonic between Turk and Golden Gate. Over here is the University of San Francisco, and up here is Lone Mountain, which was like a convent, women's college. Very Catholic neighborhood. A lot of Irish, too. I can remember when he came along. It was terrible for me.
Yeah. 4 years later, about 4 years?
And three. I do remember it, I promise. And we were over in Kittredge Terrace, and there my mother disappeared, and there he came back with Chuck. And we grew up together. It was nice. we shared a bedroom for a while. He was in his crib. I was on a regular bed, and he'd throw all his toys at me. Then I would scream, and then he'd call in our mother and say, he's keeping me awake. You see, that was difficult, but nonetheless, we survived. Just the two of us as siblings, and mother and father, and what, about 8 rooms probably in the house. And over here is St. Ignatius High School. That's where Jerry Brown went to high school at the same time I went to Lowell. And Lowell's just over across here. And in between Lowell and me, as I grew up at University of San Francisco, I hear the basketballs now. Yeah. It was Bill Russell. It was Casey Jones. And they were in that auditorium. And I'd go over and look at it, and I thought that's what basketball was. Well, I had a slightly elevated impression. So every morning in high school, I'd walk across there and go over to Lowell. And in grammar school, we went to Grant.
So you walked to school?
I walked to school in high school, and at Grant, I took the bus probably after I was about 10 or 12, 10 probably.
So was your neighborhood school, that's where your elementary school was?
The elementary school was just about, probably on the bus, it was 20 minutes, 25 minutes.
So you didn't walk to school. That's the defining feature.
No, but we did to high school. And,
interesting. Usually the other way around, yeah.
And high school was Lowell High School, a citywide academic high school. And when we were there, you did not have to take an exam to get in. There were no quotas. You had to graduate from a grammar school. And it was open citywide to anyone who wanted to send their child to a public academic high school. And it was actually a pretty good high school. We had 2 Nobel Prize winners. We had Alexander Calder, a number of people, including, and I saw the photograph back there in the green room, the most illustrious. You might think my brother was one of the more illustrious graduates, but no. The most illustrious graduate of Lowell High School was Carol Channing. And some of you are just too young to appreciate Carol Channing, but it was an open high school. And what was interesting about our neighborhood in San Francisco is we were totally surrounded by Catholics. There was St. Ignatius, a Jesuit school, USF, a Jesuit school, Presentation High School, Lone Mountain College, both of them Catholic schools. And the one place that to the east of us was a Catholic mortuary. So we were just totally surrounded, yet it was incredibly ecumenical. When my brother was bar mitzvahed, my parents invited Reverend Father Reed, who is at that time, I think, the principal of St. Ignatius High School.
Well, they had several because our dad was teaching school law at USF part of the time. He was primarily, gee, where do I begin? I mean, it's so much. You are influenced by where you came from. San Francisco was a city of neighborhoods.
Yeah.
It was Italian, Irish, Jews, blacks. Well,
not so many.
Not so many, right? And what about the Hispanic? Hispanic, yeah, south of Mission.
And
Asian, absolutely. Chinatown, but that was. There was discrimination against black people and against the Hispanic people.
So were there minorities at your high school, for example?
Yes, some.
Some. What does that mean?
Not a lot. Ravenel Williams was a black student. He was a friend of mine, and he was at Lowell. Okay, and probably what? I can't remember how many, but not many.
Was there academic tracking?
No.
Or because everybody was high academic achievers?
Yeah. Everybody. There's none of that. I think of San Francisco as like Boston, but Boston is harder edged. The differences between, you have the WASP society, you have the black sort of not too much heard of. something's going on over the mission. There's a great movie about the mission district in San Francisco called Mission that they showed at the Ninth Circuit. And there was a whole life over there. Over there, you see. It was separate. But the Irish Catholics, the Italian Catholics, the Jews, the WASPs, they weren't. They're different, but not quite so hard-edged, looking back at it. I mean, I can remember the day probably when I discovered segregation was my mother and a friend of hers who was black wanted to go out to lunch somewhere. And my mother said, let's go to the St. Francis Hotel. And she said, the African-American woman, I don't think I could go in there. They won't let me in. Huh? See, I did, that was
This
what?
is in San Francisco,
This
right?
is San Francisco.
Yeah.
This is probably early 1950s. Early 1950s. All right, so it's there. It's there, even San Francisco. But the city's a wonderful place to grow up. I mean, not just the weather, but you're down from school to
So let me ask you
Fine
about
Arts
this.
Museum.
When you were growing up, especially you, Justice Breyer, it was the time of the Japanese internment during World War II.
Yeah.
Did you experience any of that yourself? Did
No,
you...
no, we pulled down the shades. Every night I can remember that, pulling down the blackout shades. And I remember after the war, in my mind, is driving with my mother before they built the highway, the big superhighway. You'd go down and you'd be in the peninsula, and it was Tan Foran Racetrack, and she pointed that out to me, Tan Foran Racetrack. And she said that's where they held the Japanese in World War II, and the note of approval was not in her voice.
Did you know any students whose families were interned during the war?
Oh, later. No, not at that
Not
time.
then.
Look, later, it's, in Cambridge, where we lived for a long time, we still have our house there. Our next door neighbor, 4 ones, her maiden name was Bezig. She was the daughter of Ernie Bezig. Ernie Bezig used to play poker with our father. He was the head of the ACLU. He represented Korematsu.
Ah.
When he represented Korematsu in attacking the order that sent all the Japanese to intern camps, an order that Roosevelt approved, and that Earl Warren was all for it, and said later that this was the worst thing he ever did in his life. J. Edgar Hoover was against it. And J. Edgar Hoover said, well, we don't need it. And he was right, they didn't need it. And, but Korematsu was at her house, that's why I thought of it. And I went over there, and he was a feisty guy, I liked him very much. And he thought he was going to win that case. So was Bezig, and Bezig was the lawyer on the brief for Korematsu. The brief in the district court, that's his court, and in the Court of Appeals does not have the ACLU's name on it. They would not let him represent the ACLU while representing Korematsu. That's a war. But by the time it got to the Supreme Court, they shaped up. And by the time that case got to the Supreme Court, he was representing the ACLU, and as well as the Japanese American Defense League. Read that case sometime. Not just the decision. The decision came from Hirabayashi, which is the case before, which was a curfew. They were there together. And Black, according to Frankfurter, started the conference by saying, well, somebody has to win this war, Roosevelt or us, and we can't. And then they approved the taking of the Japanese and putting them in camps. By the way, Japanese citizens I'm talking about, citizens of America,
citizens, yeah.
70,000 American citizens, and including Korematsu, who never thought that would be allowed. And there we are. And so, yeah, I think that's an interesting object lesson in what? In the war, people's emotions. The good side, I'm walking along the street and my father says, that car there is the car that they send around for the Clean Plate Club. If you don't eat everything on your plate, you are going to not receive the medal of the Clean Plate Club. See, there are all kinds of things that happen in a war. Some not so bad, some terrible. And so My memory's there. I can remember walking along the street in 1945 on August 14th, see, the next day was my birthday, with my mother, and suddenly all the sirens went off, and she said, "That's the end of the war." And it was, just as we got into the Safeway. There'll be a parade tomorrow. Well, I mean, this San Francisco, it's the parks, it's the water, it's the sun, it's that you can lie in the sun, it's that you have your friends, and when you're in your senior year in high school, you're going to get out of that high school every day as early as you can so you can drive across the bay to Marin and lie by a public swimming pool and talk to your friends, and that's high school. And so the thing that worries me now about high school, tell you the truth, when I saw that they did a film about Lowell, is those students look worried. They look nervous.
Let me ask you about your father's influence on your decision to become lawyers and your legal career, particularly his work for the Board of Education. Did that affect any of your school cases, Justice Breyer, particularly the Seattle and Louisville cases? And did you have any school cases in your court that you remember?
Well, I think Steve will respond on the Seattle case. Our father, I think, influenced us in different ways. At least one strong memory I have, and I think Steve shares this memory, is that we would go across the street to vote. And that was just given. And he always included us in his voting process. And I remember it was those days that they had these big green machines and green heavy curtains that were closed by a red handle that you would pull, and that would set the voting machine so that it could record the votes. And he would hold me, and I have this very clear image. He would hold me up and he'd say, "Chucky, now do you see the top row?" He said, "Vote yes on all, pull the yes lever on all of them." 5, 6, 7, I don't know how many there were. And those were the bond issues. So afterwards, I would say, "Dad, how come we voted yes on every bond issue?" He says, "Because there are people out there who will vote no on every issue, and I want to countermand their votes." And it was sort of a lesson to me in affirming government. In that government does have a good purpose, and it's got to be allowed to do things. And I think Steve and I were raised in a family that was extraordinarily positive in the sense of participation in government. You wouldn't think of not participating. And that was pretty strong.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if I traded, he doesn't remember this. This is my father's watch.
I don't know how he got this. I
got it because I traded you every other thing that we inherited, which was nearly nothing, so that I could get the watch which you had drawn. But it says Irving Breyer, SFUSD, San Francisco Unified School District, 1933 to 1973. And what was he like? He said, the first thing you have to know if you're going to be school board attorney. Katanji's father, by the way.
Yes,
her father he's a lawyer for the Miami School Board. And I said, well, when she was my law clerk, and I said, that's our similarity here, and it's a big one. Because my father used to say, the first thing you have to know, if you're going to be the lawyer for the school board, you have to know something about geography. You say, geography? Why? What geography got to do with it? Because you have to know, where is City Hall? Yes, that's right. And the advice that he gave me when he died, stay on the payroll. See, this was a generation, and yeah, that's right. And
have you succeeded? Yes.
Yes, I have. I've always been on the payroll.
And you're still on the payroll, right?
Yeah, of course. That's the first. Absolutely important. Did it affect me regardless of school? It affected me the way. Being part of San Francisco, I'm not explaining it as well as I'd like to, but at that time, you're part of a city of neighborhoods, you're a part of a city where people contribute in a lot of different ways to being part of a bigger community, which is the city, and it was not conceivable to me that you could live your life without being a part of several communities that are trying to live together in a reasonable way. Those aren't words on paper. That was our life growing up from the time I was born in 1938 up through the time I went off to college in 1955. And then he came along and started throwing toys at me. And moreover, he really looked terrible because he was allergic to cow's milk, so he had to drink goat's milk, so he didn't smell very good. And then they had to put this sort of white cream all over him. I said, who is that? Take him back. There we are. We got on pretty well, actually.
Well, I think it's time for me to interject, because apparently this is sort of degenerated to what really annoyed each other about each other, And nothing annoyed, actually, in truth. I mean, what annoyed me about my brother was that he never found me, and this continues to this day, as funny as I thought I was. And so he would get annoyed one way or the other. But
when you go to night and they'd say, now you have to kiss your brother good night, you always pinch the back of my neck.
What sort of resonated with me over time was when my brother was 15 and a half. I have to go back some to get there. He had a learner's permit. And my parents thought it would be a very good idea to give Stephen practice driving. So we went off for the family vacation to a place called Lake Arrowhead, which was in Southern California. We were going up through the mountains, and Steve was driving. My father was in the passenger seat, and my mother and I were in the back seats. And we were driving along, going up this sort of winding mountain road, when suddenly I heard my father scream, "Stephen, stop!" The car came to an abrupt stop, and I saw that we were headed over a cliff. And my father, who was aghast, I didn't really see it, but I see with the same urgency that my father did. I said, "What were you doing, Stephen? What were you doing?" And Stephen said, "Well, I was thinking." And that's what happens with my brother. So I warned all of his law clerks. I said, if you see that my brother is thinking about something, be very careful. Your safety's in jeopardy.
So I'd like to turn to your choice of going to college. You went to Stanford.
Yeah.
And why? And then I want to ask you, Judge, why
Oh,
you didn't go to
it is.
Stanford.
That's my father going to Stanford.
Why?
No, why you didn't go to Stanford, but...
That's simple. And it says a lot about us. As my brother was growing up, my mother's challenge was to get his nose out of books. He would read constantly, not at anyone's urging, but it was sort of self-generated. He wanted to read. So my parents thought it might be a good idea. And of course, he got into Harvard, he got into Stanford, but it might be a good idea that he go to Stanford because there were other interests that he ought to pursue. And I think they were, rather than just academic, I think that was right. With me, you'll never guess it, it was the opposite problem. I would never read, and my parents thought it was a good idea to try to get Chuck's nose into a book. And so to my brother's everlasting credit, and my everlasting, I don't want to take credit, but I'll take gratitude, is that my parents wanted to send me to Stanford. I was admitted to Harvard, and Steve went in, and they were concerned because they didn't let Steve go to Harvard. He did go to Stanford, and they thought that this might bespeak an unequal, treatment. And Steve went in and he says, "I think Chucky should go to Harvard, and he can use that education." And so I'm very grateful for that.
The Stanford you went to was quite different from the Stanford there is now.
Well, I don't know the Stanford there is now as well. I love being at Stanford.
You've been out there a few times.
And we had the same thing, and my greatest achievement at Stanford was the spring quarter, because I arranged it so I had virtually no courses. I think I had none. And you'd lie out again on the lawn and go swimming, and it was absolutely fantastically, it was fun. It was fun. I enjoyed it a lot. And I think in my parents' mind, actually was my mother's brother, who tried to teach philosophy, and he was teaching at Harvard, and then he taught at Johns Hopkins. He was pretty intellectual, and she didn't think it was a good idea that I become too intellectual, and she wasn't certain I should fall under his influence. Leo. Yeah, and this is Leo. I love Leo. I love Leo. But Leo, he one day he says, look, there's an interesting meeting at Cambridge Rindge and Tech. Let's go. So I go off there, last row. We're sitting in the last row. People used to know him at Harvard, carry a green book bag everywhere. Or we're sitting in the last row, and they're talking about rent control. All right? And one of the landlords is talking, and he says, look, I'm not trying to gouge my tenants, but I do need some more rent so I can keep the building up. And all I want to do is keep up the building, not to earn some huge profit. And I've lived here for 35 years in Cambridge, and ask anyone who knows me, and they'll tell you I'm no liar. So Leo shouts out from the back in an audience of about 200 or 300 people. He shouts out, I know you and you are a liar, he says. so this was Leo. So now I guess the point of all this is really because does it make a difference to a person's opinion? Yes. That I went to Lowell High School, that I grew up in San Francisco, at the time that I did, that, of course it makes a difference. Why? Because the words in this document, liberty, the freedom of the press, they don't explain themselves. I mean, you have cases, and you have what people have written about it, but you'll get a case 90 times out of 100 that can't be answered directly from what people have written before. And there are several possible answers. And does the person's background have something to do with how he is going to decide this case? Probably. And I first thought that so people should agree with me more. Here, I've seen disagreement in San Francisco and in Cambridge, Mass, but I've never really. There's a lot more disagreement here, and I really thought, well, I don't see why they don't agree with me all the time. I'm so reasonable. But then I thought, well, it's a big country. It's a big country, and there are a lot of different points of view. And my mother used to say, there's no point of view so crazy that there isn't somebody in this country who doesn't hold it. And she said they all live in Los Angeles, but that was at a time. but in any case, so I thought maybe it isn't so bad. Maybe it isn't such a terrible thing that people have really different points of view. And the thing to do is the same thing you might do in people in different neighborhoods in San Francisco when you're growing. Get along with them. Don't change your principles. Don't change your principles, but try to understand where people are coming from. And so
there are different points
that's why it may be of some interest, if I can remember properly, which I haven't really thought the thing through. What was it like growing up in the 50s, late 40s, watching on television? What? We didn't have television until maybe 1950, 48. Crusader Rabbit. I once told Jim Lehrer that I loved Crusader Rabbit because he sent me the entire set of Crusader Rabbit. And anyone who wants to see it can come to our house in Cambridge, and there I have it right there. He did not send Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, but nonetheless, that was the world then. And when I looked at that, what was so popular, the television series, The Mad Men, about the ad men, did you see it? And yeah, it was right in a sense, but it was wrong in a sense.
So as you know, the court has a major case on affirmative action, and we don't talk about the case in here, but what was it like in terms of the minorities at Stanford when you were there?
Not very many. Not very many. It's
and not much diversity.
Harder for me to remember African Americans at Stanford. I'm sure there were some. There was about 1/3 women. But the attitude towards, now, it's just natural. Lowell, there were half women, and Stanford maybe 1/3, and the committees that I was on, or the different student organizations, there was no thing about women, and there was no thing for or against. And I don't think so. I really don't think so. So that was not till I got to the East. Not till I got to the East did I suddenly see, hey, why are there only 14 women in my class at Harvard Law School? Huh? And I thought it was sort of, Dodick and I would sit there and we'd have where? Well, what's going on? What's going on? But that's coming out of San Francisco. And probably if I'd come out of some other place in a different part of the country, it would have I would have had a different attitude.
So let me turn to another subject. Justice Breyer, I didn't know this until recently, but you were in the Army Reserves.
No, when you were in the Navy.
Yes, well, about the same time. Tell
Navy
me how that
Reserve.
came about.
It came about because the Korean War had just ended, and the draft was just ending, and nobody knew when it was going to start, and I thought it would be interesting and important to do. So I joined the Army for that program, 6 months of active duty, 8.5 years of reserve.
We both did the Army
too.
Reserves, and basically
Fort Ord.
the theme was that we are the last line of defense. Now, of course, what that meant was women and children first, and then us. So, but it was a time, at least when I was in, that there was a significant call-up of troops, because it was during Vietnam, it was during the Tet Offensive, it was during, very, very serious time. And I think that was, while the childhood was pretty optimistic, and that's a question of luck. You don't choose your parents. You're there, and you don't choose your existence in the early years. But what happened afterwards, to both Steve and myself, was the dose of reality. And for me, it started with the assassination of President Kennedy. And it was then, if you remember back there, it was a succession of pretty horrible things. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, the burning of Detroit, the marches, Kent State, and all of this optimism that we had as children was tempered by the reality. I think I could never appreciate the civil rights movement until the 60s, because it wasn't what I had experienced. But I'll tell you, the reality of that, I think, changed both of our lives. We both worked on Watergate. And indeed, the interesting thing about Watergate, from our point of view, was it was really a triumph, ultimately, of the rule of law, and in particular, all of the parts of the Constitution that were put there in the 1700s, the right to assemble, grand juries, essentially the right to protest, and any number of rights that are enumerated in the Constitution, they all came to play in Watergate. And that, for us, I think, was pretty much a high watermark, that we thought, well, this Constitution and this country work if allowed to work. And it was an enormous impression on us. And I think that Stephen, do you feel that way?
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, if you talk about the armed forces particularly,
yeah.
I mean, they're being in, as you know, being in the armed forces at that time, going through basic training, you meet a lot of people you wouldn't have otherwise
Absolutely.
met. I might not have. And that's a totally good thing, in my opinion.
And when did you do the basic training?
I did my basic training in '58.
This was, you were off?
While I was at Stanford. I took a quarter off, and
Oh, that's right, they had the quarter
it was the
system.
summer and the quarter. And we were at Fort Ord. And you suddenly became real. When you're actually doing the training, they're shooting bullets over your head, so you better not get up. And you suddenly realize there's more to being a citizen of the United States. And people have sacrificed a lot more for this country than you might normally be thinking of every day. And I think that was a very, very good experience.
What was your job? Was your
Oh,
MOS?
after I did 6 weeks, it was 8 weeks of basic training. Then I think you had a week off, and then I came to Fort Holabird. It was intelligence, because there was an intelligence unit at Stanford. And we'd spend the 2 weeks in the summer at the Pentagon. It was pretty interesting. But I think the most important part probably was the basic training.
And the Army at that time, even though technically it wasn't segregated, In fact, in many ways it was, not necessarily along racial lines, but in my company that I was placed in, there was one platoon of people from Alaska, another a platoon from people from Hawaii, a third of people who were either not high school graduates or just graduates, high school graduates, and then the fourth were those people who had a college or a post-college education.
That wasn't true when I was there.
What?
That was not true when I was at Fort
Well,
Ord.
it was certainly true at Fort Ord for me, and I will tell
They put you in a
this.
special segregated unit where you were the only one there because they were afraid what would happen if you got loose.
Well, I'll tell you, it did make you appreciate that America is a very complicated, diverse country. And there are people who, and a lot of people, who didn't have the same advantages that we had growing up, and that they're a part of it. And so you have to understand that when you're going to do something.
It's obvious. But it's why when I was with Sandra O'Connor and Tony Kenny and Ruth, we were over in Luxembourg, and we wanted to go and see the graves, you know, the Battle of the Bulge. And so we went there, and you sit there and you look out and you think that those people had no life so that I could have a nice life.
Yeah.
And that's all part of the armed forces of the United States. It needn't be the Army. It could be some other way of cooperating and understanding fellow citizens and understanding that this is a very big country with a lot of neighborhoods and a lot of communities. And how we hold it together is part of the responsibility, I guess, of a human being who lives in the United States of America.
So do you think your military experience had any effect on your judging? The Guantanamo cases?
No. Oh, the Guantanamo.
National
Yeah, but
security?
you can't be too. No one when you're judging, you have all these briefs. You have cases that were decided. You have an issue. It's well argued, and then there are open parts. There are open parts. If you're in the Supreme Court, particularly, he can do what he wants as a district judge, and I would rely on his judgment. Even his.
That's what I tell. I say, my brother, I have enormous influence over a little itty bit. I said, and you have limited influence over everybody. So, you know, I don't know how it plays out, but
I don't know what happens in the district
it's suited
court.
to our personalities, I think would be the correct
No, but
answer.
your permanent Jackie, I think, was who sat.
Yes.
She sat she got called for jury duty. I've been called for jury duty 3 times, and she got called in San Francisco, and the judge had explained it was a criminal case. She was selected. The judge explained the presumption of innocence, and he said, "Now you understand, the government has to prove that this person is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and if they don't prove it, you vote innocent." And all right, did you understand that? Because right now, there's no evidence that's been introduced yet. So is there anyone here in this room who thinks now, before any evidence, that the defendant is guilty? No, the defendant raised his hand. So nobody knew what to do. All right, he faces problems like that. I face other problems.
Did you ever sit in a district court as a district judge?
No. And I don't know, it takes time to
But
learn
Mark,
that.
I would
Hard
only
job.
point out, those of you who knew my wife, Cindy Goldstein, she was also summoned for jury duty and asked whether she knew anybody connected to the judicial system. Of course, yes, my husband's a judge. Oh, well, okay, oh yeah. And by the way, and my brother-in-law is also a member of the judiciary, she didn't say on the Supreme Court. The judge who is conducting the voir dire was the grandson of Earl Warren. And so it's like, that's a small town. And anyway, the proceedings go, and he says, "Oh, I know who your family is," and so forth. And he said, "Now, is there anybody who doesn't believe in the presumption of innocence?" My wife, who I think wanted to get off jury duty, raised her hand. And she says, "Ms. Goldstein, you come from this family, you don't believe in the presumption of innocence?" She said, no, I believe in the presumption of guilt. And so that, of course, reflected on me, knowing.
So after you graduated from Stanford, you went to England. You studied at Oxford.
Yeah.
Tell us your thinking about that. Was just you had to go to school again, and that was a good.
No, it was great. I loved it, actually.
Did you have a particular plan in mind when you went?
No, my plan was
Good.
My plan was to. It was lovely. It was great. We had a very good time.
What did you study?
Philosophy, politics, and economics. But so the English idea, even in Stanford, you might sometimes pretend that you were working harder than you were. But the idea in England is you must pretend that you're working less hard. And you certainly don't give the impression you're working all the time or studying all the time. And you don't. You meet a lot of different people. We travel. Today it's easier for students all over the place in the United States to spend a couple of months or a couple of years, or a year, or a few months in a foreign place, which I think is a very, very good thing because I loved it so much. But at the time I grew up, before I went to England, the only place I got out of San Francisco, my father would sometimes take me on the Lark to go down to Los Angeles for a school convention when he was going to. I mean, people didn't travel to the same degree.
When was the first time you flew on an airplane? Do you remember?
First time. The first time I went on an exchange to France in '56. We went over on a boat. It was a student ship, and I feel sorry for the present students because they don't have that experience. That was something. It was great, actually. And we came back on an airplane. And so probably sometime towards the later part of the 1950s. But the real question you're asking is, how does this influence the way that I might decide a case? And I can't say it has no influence, but I can't pin down an influence. Nobody is trying to decide in favor of the school board because his father was a lawyer for the school board. It might be you think you understand their problems, and you might not, because beware. One of the first things you begin to understand as a judge is beware of starting to think you understand something just because, and be careful, because very often you don't understand what you think you understand. And so listen, find out what other people think, but underneath this is you're a certain kind of person by the time you're in your 50s. And you have views, and the views are, what is this country like? And the views are, what is this document, the Constitution, about? And the views are, well, why do we have laws in the first place? You might not be able to articulate those views, but you have them. And they can be different with different people. And if you say, do those views, call them philosophical or jurisprudential or basic beliefs, do they influence the result? Yes, I'm sure they do. But I can't tell you how because I don't know how. But you are the person you are. Try to decide things fairly, soundly, and so forth, and fine. But you are the person that you are, and that's just in those seconds.
You mentioned that you studied in France, and I think everyone recognizes that you write in French, read in French, and speak in French. How did you get to be so fluent?
No, I'm not that fluent, but I mean, I was told 30 years ago by the ambassador here, he said, if you really want to speak a foreign language, including French, which you wanted me to keep up, read it for half an hour a day. And you'll find, and that's what I probably, not every day, but most days, yeah. And what I say to when I talk to the college students, and they all say, well, what should I study to be a judge? Or what should I study to be a lawyer? I say, hey, you're in college, you know? You will go to law school later. Don't worry about it. This is your chance. You can study the humanities. You can study history. You can study literature. Learn a foreign language. Why? Because you have your life that you will know. You'll have perhaps a family. You will have your own family. You'll have your own friends. That's minuscule. You start learning a foreign language, you start reading some literature, you start learning a little bit of history and so forth, your eyes will open to experiences that go beyond your own life. This is your chance. Do it for 4 years.
An example of this was when my brother and I bicycled in Alsace.
Yeah.
And Steve at that time was contemplating the construction of a courthouse in Boston. And we spent a lot of time in plazas, right, looking at, or courthouse, looking where do people gather? What does that say about court? I mean, I think you want to describe a little bit about the courthouse.
In Boston?
Because it's odd for a judge to immerse him or herself in the architecture of the building where they're going to have a courthouse. But
it was Harry Cobb, who was Pay Cobb Fried, who's I.M. Pay's partner. He got the architectural award. But why? And this is not quite on the point, but that's why. Because Doug Woodlock and I we probably spent a day a week for 2 or 3 years on this project. And what did Harry say? We had some very good architects in the final rounds. We had Caesar Pelli, we had Venturi, we had Skidmore Owens in New York, and so forth. So what did Harry get? He showed us a picture of the a courthouse in 17th century courthouse in Virginia. And he said, look at that building. You see a porch. That's because it's down in the center of the city, and people gather on that porch, whether they're lawyers or judges or whoever they are. They can be, people in the city, and they talk, or they may play chess, or they may just gossip, but it's a part of the community. And look at that steeple. That steeple on that courthouse tells you something, says it's a public building. And then inside, there's one room, and at the end of that room is a judge. That's where the public's business is conducted. Now, he says, I'll show you the 19th century. And there you see the, like San Francisco's. It's a dome, and again, a public building, dome with a little cupola on the top, and you have inside a place where people can gather. And there are 4 courtrooms that open off. Now I'll show you what happened in the 20th century. Go look at the courthouse in Cambridge, and he shows us a picture. Or go look at the courthouse, the federal courthouse in Los Angeles. And there are quite a few like that. Look at it. Now, just tell me, is that a courthouse, or is it an office building? Is it a courthouse, or is it a hospital, or is it an apartment building? I don't know. You say? No. We don't want apartment buildings. And we don't want business buildings. We don't want hospitals. We want a building that says it's a courthouse, and when somebody comes in, he says, go look at the one in Melbourne. Pretty good. Pretty good. You go in there, and that's what we wanted Harry to do, and he did it. This building belongs to the public. The judges are like the furniture. They're part of the job. Go look at the courthouse on the Strand in London. It's done in a style of probably secular Gothic. And what that means is it looks like a marketplace. And the marketplace, it's the lawyers who are going across the marketplace with their dossiers or with the client's business. And the judges are there. They're part of it. But it's not their building. They're part of the work that goes on there. And it's public work that goes on there. And you want people who have not even known a lawyer to feel free to come into this building and to have a dinner there, or to look out at the view, or to have a picnic on the, all right, that's the kind of what? You say, did I learn some of that in Europe? Yeah, but I learned some of it over in the USA too. And
so what do you think about courthouses now after 9/11 and your court?
No, don't listen to you listen to the security people, but the one thing we did on this, in the 2-3 years, is Woodlock and I sat in on their meetings. And when they want to do everything that's security, you say, hey, I'll tell you something. In the conciergerie on the Ile de la Cité in France, there is the most important court building in the world, and it's also one of the most beautiful things, that stained glass. And they have to go in through security, and they bring in through security 1 million, perhaps, of people a year. So you can do it. You can make the building feel open and still secure. But you have to participate, the judges, and you have to get people in that room with the security people and with the GSA and with the others, so you get, I mean, he put up, in San Francisco, which is not necessarily the building that's the most beautiful in the world, but he did put up paintings everywhere, or those pictures of courthouses. Or is that enough of courthouses?
Problem about, I mean, just to carry the theme a bit forward, and to find this, quote, silver lining in COVID, it was for the judiciary an opportunity, actually a necessity, to introduce Zoom court proceedings. And I'm talking not about jury trials, I'm talking about hearings, I'm talking about the whole process by way of Zoom, and in some cases trials. That had the effect of showing the public what goes on, at least from a federal judge's point of view, what goes on in the courtroom. So I found in the 25 years that I've been a judge that when I talk to jurors about serving on the jury, and when I talk to them about what it means to have the presumption of innocence, what it means of the burden of proof, and what it means that defendants do not have to testify, that their idea of basically of the justice system is generated, the origins are through Judge Judy, who parenthetically, I would point out, gets $1 million for each one of her appearances in court. But that they don't understand until a judge explains to them why, in a criminal case, a defendant need not do anything. And that they can't consider the fact that they haven't heard the defendant's version of the events as evidence of guilt. And I think, now I'm not talking about the Supreme Court, I'm not talking about cameras, though there are cameras in circuit courts broadcasting arguments, and we have found in district courts, properly utilized, which means you don't have a jury on television, you don't even have a judge on television. You have the witnesses and then somebody can hear. It actually furthers the understanding that the public has of the judicial system, and that's good. I think that is really good, and I think it's the technological equivalent today of what courthouses were 200 years ago, where people could walk in, because now it's very difficult to walk in.
Well, somebody once said that if the chief judge of the district court had to go through security about once a month, they would decide whether it was as friendly as they thought it was. Remember in the military where the officer had to go through the mess line to be sure that the enlisted men were being properly fed. So that's the same kind of principle. All right, I want to turn now, if I can, to the questions. We had 140 questions came in from students and others. And let me start by grouping them in the early years and answer them any way we want. There will be no motions to strike for non-responsive answers. So just talk about what prompts you. So what are the most important lessons you learned from your childhood, your values and so forth, and who were the influential people in your lives?
Usually the most important, influential, your parents, or lessons we talked about. San Francisco, the only thing I think we haven't mentioned, which was pretty good then, and certainly Sandra was for it, and now bringing this back, is that we had classes in government. I mean, senior civics in high school. And we'd get on the bus and we'd go up to Sacramento and we'd sit in the governor's office, and then we'd have Youth in Government Day, and people learned how the government worked. And I do not see how our government is going to work unless people learn when they're students about how this democracy should work and how it does work. And that, I think, is pretty important. Okay, so I'd say that's a lasting lesson. The lesson internally is take part. That's what I say to the graduates. I wish for you, what?
The most important influence has been my brother, who tries to teach me that I should listen before I speak, and has had modest success in that endeavor.
When did you first see yourselves as becoming lawyers and then judges?
In those days, you sort of tended to do what your parents thought you should do. No one ever told me to be a lawyer, but I thought I probably would be. My father was a lawyer.
Well, I think
What do you think?
here comes the truth. The fact is that we came from a family, two of my mother's brothers were professors, and Stephen certainly had the academic qualifications and interest to be a professor. And he went to Harvard, and he was a professor at Harvard, but there was almost a siren call that he still participate in the political process, to which I think he owes Senator Kennedy the debt of gratitude of being somebody who is very grounded in trying to make things happen and accomplish things. And I think that became an irresistible pull for Stephen to get back into the process, not change his attitude towards things, but to actually be involved in the process of developing consensus where possible. Now, for me, I wanted to be an actor, but actually what happened was I never got a call back, and so here I am today.
That isn't what happened. What happened was he went to summer stock after he got a starring part at the Hasty Pudding Show. So he goes to summer stock, and he hears two of the people at the summer stock talking, and one says, "How are things going, Ed?" And Ed says, "Well, not bad. It's possible I'll get a job this month, but I haven't had any work for the last year." So he went to law school. All right.
All right, we know you would have been in the theater, but what about you, Justice? What would you have done if you hadn't gone to law school?
Sorry?
What would you have done if you hadn't gone to law school?
Probably would have been out in the street. I don't know. I always thought I would go to law school. I just thought I would. There we are.
How about becoming a judge? When did you first think about the possibility of becoming a judge?
I first thought about it when we were trying to get our judges appointed. I worked for Senator Kennedy, for several years, and I was chief counsel of judiciary. And I think we were trying to get various judges through, and there were some that were harder to get confirmed than others, and we worked on that. We wanted Archie Cox appointed to the seat that I got. Nobody thought of me. No, Archie Carter didn't want to appoint Archie Cox. And he said, "Oh, he's too old," or whatever it was. And then Civiletti, who was the AG, said we should appoint somebody from Puerto Rico, but Bars and the people in Puerto Rico couldn't agree on who to appoint. And he said, "Well, what about," and Senator Chafee got into an argument, I remember, on that. So they were all arguing. Time was passing. And I think Ken Weinberg said to Kennedy, "Well, why don't we appoint Breyer?" So I think that happened the day before he suggested it. And there we are. So I say, I know firsthand.
So you never thought about becoming a judge before that?
No. I mean, anybody who's a lawyer thinks maybe I'll be a judge, okay? At that level, yes. But being appointed a federal judge is like lightning striking. And being appointed to the Supreme Court is like lightning striking twice in the same place. And I promise you that every member of the court knows that. They absolutely, whether they admit it or not, they know it. And they know that there could be at least 10 people, maybe 50 people, who could have been appointed to the Supreme Court instead of them. And I'm glad they know it, and they do know it, and I know it, and so does everybody else. So there we are. But Lee Campbell, who was a colleague of mine on the First Circuit, said the line he always liked in Tolstoy, there was a general, and the general began to speak, and here's what he said. He said, "Don't ask how I got to this position of being a general. It doesn't matter how I got here. What matters is what I do here." Yeah, good point.
But our students are interested in how you got there.
All right, I know this. That's my father's advice. My father's advice along those lines is you do your job, and you do it as well as you can. And you listen somewhat to other people. Now, if you do it well, people may notice, and they may give you a better job. Yeah, or they may not. But if they don't, you at least have the satisfaction of having done your job well, which is some satisfaction.
Judge Breyer, did you have the same incidental occurrence?
Well, I mean, I think that it helps to be the last person standing in the room that the decision maker then turns and says, well, I think it ought to be X, I think it ought to be Y. I mean, I have to tell you that I agree with Steve. I mean, enormous amount of luck is involved in this whole process. And I remember when I first thought about being a judge, I have a very close friend who is Jerry Brown's appointment secretary, state judge. I actually didn't want to go on the state court because they have to do a lot of work. And so I thought, well, you know, I'd love to be a federal judge, but I don't quite know how to do it. That's a joke, you see, because every federal judge knows one United States senator. That's that's possibly the story. But anyway, he said to me, well, Jerry Brown has appointed over 500 judges in the state of California. Actually, California has the largest judiciary, larger than the judiciary of Great Britain. And it's an enormous judiciary, it has several thousand judges. He said, of the judges that Jerry Brown appointed, he said, and he had appointed at that point 400 or 500 judges, he said, I can count on one hand, maybe two, the number of judges that we had to reach out to that judge to appoint. And if you want to be a judge, you should make it known that you want to be a judge and talk to people about being a judge. And I think that is a practical thing. There's an art to it, not a science, but there certainly is an art to how you advance your own candidacy, but usually it is, and I think Steve's right, it's other people saying, I looked at this person, and this is why I think this person would be good. So it's the other people who become your advocates in the process.
Yeah, and I'm talking about the Court of Appeals.
Yes.
The Supreme Court's a different story.
Oh, yes, yes.
And but there's still, it's among the, if you're honest about it, I mean, so there are 5 or 10 or 15, I mean, depending, or maybe more people who could have been appointed. And it's what's going on in the president's mind and in the world and so forth.
Our students are also interested in other kinds of advice. What do you do? What do you recommend to students while they're in law school? And what's your advice for them when they're starting out in practice? Tips, things that work for you?
Sure. I mean, and unfortunately, you've hit a really responsive note because I decided maybe I shouldn't say something about the Stanford students. But if you've been following that, a member of the Fifth Circuit was invited to speak at Stanford and got to Stanford it was an appellate court, Fifth Circuit judge. He got there to speak and was heckled by the students with such vigor that he couldn't get a word out of his speech. And subsequently, the dean wrote a really wonderful letter. It's 10 pages in length, praised by both the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal opinion pages as being probably really a terrific exposition of the First Amendment. And one would think that law students, above all, should understand the value of a process where people express contrary and sometimes odious views, that they have to be addressed in a civilized way. And so I would just say to law students, look, 2 things. Number one, realize that there is a process out there for expressing your views. And the smart thing, if you have very strong views about things, is learn how to challenge, learn how to present them. That's one thing. The other thing I would say to law students is, law's great. Law school can be great, but you don't have to practice law. You can do other things. And I would say to them, try the path not traveled. I know that's cliched, but it's so important for you to follow your passion, because then you'll be good at what you do. Follow your passion, and it may or may not be in the law, but learn how this process works and respect the process.
How about graduating from law school? It's been a while since you just graduated from law school. Yes, me too. Thinking back, what advice would you give to students as they're starting out in their careers? what to do, what not to do? Any good advice you got? Any bad advice that you realize is bad? What do you think?
Two things. I would say I've gotten three pieces of good advice. And one was what my father said, which is do your job as well as you can and pay attention to what other people say, and somebody may notice you'll get a different one, etc. The second was Bayless Manning, who was dean at Stanford at that time, and I was trying to figure out where should I work and so forth. He said, you know, when you just graduate from law school and you want to figure out what to do, when you're trying to figure out what college to go to, what school to go to, you will only know about 3% of the things that would be really helpful that you would know. But there is no way to know that other 97%. So lighten up and figure out what will happen is you'll choose on the basis of what you do know. I would advise against being a trapeze star unless you actually have been doing a lot of practicing. But within a broad number of broad limits, you will make a choice based on that 3%. And there we are. And then your life will fold itself around your choices. And you'll have some very good days, and you'll have some that aren't so good.
So you're not in favor of big planning?
Well, big planning, what does that mean? It means you go and figure out on the basis of what you know and what you want to do and so forth and so on. There is no answer to that question. It's like saying, in England, I'm sure that influenced my best choice, which was who I would marry. She's English. And there we are, okay? So sometimes you'll be lucky, and sometimes you won't be. There we are. And the other advice that I got, which I think is helpful right now, and that was working for Senator Kennedy. And what did he say to do? Because I think we do have problems now in the country of division and people not listening and so forth. Of course we do. And what Kennedy would say in those is, listen to what the person says. We want to get a bill through, or we want to get this done or that done, and somebody else doesn't want to. And so go and talk to the other person. And when Mill said that. He said, the first thing you do when you think you're so right is find somebody who thinks the opposite, and you think he's an intelligent person, and listen to him. And by the way, the key word's listen. Go to that other person, and don't just tell him how right you are. No, that'll get you nowhere. That will lead him or her to start saying how right she is, okay? So listen. And the more you talk, and the more you listen, the better. And before you know it, that individual will say something you actually agree with. And as soon as they say something you actually agree with, you say, that's a good idea. Let's see if we can't do something with that. And then you try to work with that. And if you end up with something that's, say, 20% of what you wanted, that's better than getting 100% of nothing. And you may be, with 100% of nothing, the most popular person in the world with your normal supporters. Forget it. You can't completely forget it if you're a senator, but still, the point is, try to forget that and take the 20% or take the 30% rather than 100% of nothing. Okay? And then I saw him do this so often. I saw him do it. If the thing does succeed and you sort of get somewhere, and then given his job, there'll be press. And the press says, Senator Kennedy, this is pretty good. You really did a great job. You say, which is truthful, Orrin helped me on this. It was Orrin's idea that we do such and such. Forget it. Credit is a weapon. Don't worry about it if you don't get it. Hey, if the thing is a success, there'll be plenty of credit to go around. And if it's not a success, who wants the credit? I heard him say that a lot. And I saw him practice it, too. You can't do it 100%. But so when I talked to the students at Stanford, which I did about a year ago about this, and I said, it's important you get out there and you talk. No, you listen. And you don't just sit in your room and go look at the mirror. That's the first place when you want to see what the problem is in the United States, because you're there looking at the mirror and you're not out, finding out what other people think. And does that always work? No. But is that helpful? Yes. It was to me. It has been to me. And Those are the things that I would like to see in the law students, in the college students, in the next generation. And you're not going to get them if you don't teach them something about how the government works, et cetera. Now, that's the whole story.
So I have one final non-law related question for both of you. If you were having a dinner party and you could invite one person, living or dead, to join you at the dinner table, who would that companion be? This is from...
When you say living or dead?
Brianna Rodriguez, law school class of 2023.
Well, I suppose if I could invite someone, or maybe two, living or dead, it would be my parents. It would be my parents to thank them. That I don't think, you know, it's a very interesting thing. As you get older, you think back, because you're looking through the wrong end of the telescope at that point, and you look back and you say, well, what really influenced you? What made a difference in your life? What are the things that you regret having done, and what are the things that you are proud of having done? And I suppose, in a way, I regret not being able to appreciate my parents in the way of letting them know how much I appreciated them. And so I know that's sort of corny, but that's my honest answer to it. What would yours be?
Justice?
Well, you're thinking of public people. I mean, it depends on what I wanted to know. If I wanted to know something about the current problems I'd like to ask Frederick Douglass this question. After the end of the Civil War, he was worried, now what's going to happen to the former slaves? And now what do we do? And he was more in the direction of just, say, staying in the South and working with labor. But maybe that was wrong. Do you think it was wrong? What would we do now? If I wanted to know, what do you think of America today? It would be Henry Adams. I think all the college students should read that book, The Education of Henry Adams. He had seen this country change dramatically, and I'd like to know what he thinks. But if it's just a person,
Yeah.
I'd really like to know what he thinks. Benjamin Franklin. Choose anybody, that's who I choose. I think he's, I'd like to know what he thinks.
And that's the final word. Can we thank the Justice Breyer and Judge Breyer for their wonderful...
Thank you. Okay?
So now comes the logistical steps that we'll take to dismiss the people who are leaving and to ask those who are going to attend the reception on stage to just stay seated. So I almost want to just sit here and think for another 15 minutes about what we've heard. But instead, come back on May 16th and we'll continue the conversation. So those of you that are leaving, thank you for being here.